Africa really has been put on the investment front burner as a result of the weakness in the West. And that's I suppose, the unintended positive consequence for the African continent. For foreign investors, suddenly, Africa becomes a potential destination for their investment dollars. They're prepared now to invest in investment instruments that in countries that they'd barely heard of 5 or 10 years ago. And this, I think, is highly significant as a consequence of the financial crisis in the West. The advent of Africa's time arriving was certainly one of my core issues. We've seen Africa's growth in GDP numbers, in the hard statistics, be quite impressive over the course of the last decade. And I think that there is a huge infrastructural deficit across the African continent. There's pressure on Africa's cities. There's a growth of populations, particularly urban populations. And of course, there are economic bottlenecks that can be addressed by huge levels of investment across this continent. So there's great potential for the cement industry in looking beyond South Africa into Africa. Now, China's arrival, of course, in Africa to secure commodities, be they agribusiness, be they land, be they mining and extractive commodities, in fact has brought benefit to the African continent. Yes, there is a suspicion that neo-colonialism is part and parcel of what China is involved with in Africa. But at the same time, there has been huge infrastructural growth through projects across the continent, be they railway networks, be they better roads, be they airports, critical areas of infrastructure that has helped Africa and perhaps provided Africa with some sort of platform from which to grow. The real issue for Africa now is that it cannot rely purely on China. It cannot rely upon China's economy growing at the same levels that it has grown at in the last decade. Africa has to become much more self-sufficient. It has to up its own domestic economies through domestic manufacturing and, of course, through prudent policies, economic policies, and outstanding governance, which has been lacking on the continent. And I think only through creating a domestic industry will Africa really be able to say we are forging a sustainable future. By looking at areas which have got a better than average access to these important trading blocks that have now occurred in Africa. You can achieve economies of scale if you go into East Africa because of the East African trading communities and because of the ease of cross-border trade that's becoming very, very important in West Africa, East Africa, and the SADC regions in South Africa. I think these are very critical points to consider when doing business across the continent. I'm not saying that it's easy to do business in Africa. It's probably the most difficult continent anywhere in the world. But ultimately, given the population growth figures, the demand of these new middle classes for goods and services and logistics and a better standard of living, which they will demand from their governments over the next few decades, missing out on this African growth story, I think, would be a major downside to any business, whether they are a relatively large business in South Africa or whether they are an emerging business as well.